Contrast in photography has the power to lead the viewer's eye. It can act as guidance, which naturally lets our focus flow through a photograph to the one point, the subject that the photo is about. Contrast can intensify the mood or the feeling that is being communicated, which can enhance the overall experience of engaging with a photo. Contrast is also capable of adding conceptual or contextual ideas and messages to a photograph, which give the photograph the depth that a viewer can dive into. All in all, contrast is a powerful tool in photography and can do so much to enhance our pieces of art in ways we might haven't thought of. In today's video, I want to dissect contrast in photography. I think this is a fun topic to break down because contrast is often reduced to much less than it actually is. I believe the understanding of just how big of a topic contrast really is not solely important for the photographer, but just as beneficial for the viewer. While the photographer obviously should have a deep understanding of contrast and use it effectively when crafting a photograph, the viewer can gain a lot of joy out of the same understanding, I believe. It will help reading a photograph in different ways. So, let's dive into the core of what contrast is, and then slowly work ourselves out to all the different places contrast likes to go. So, contrast is, in its purest form, I suppose simply difference. By having difference between two things, contrast is created. A simple example in photography is what I would consider the most widely known type of contrast, tonal contrast, the difference between light and dark. This is what most people think of when speaking of contrast, but the aim of this video is to broaden our perspective and explore all the different forms of contrast, seeing as contrast is actually only difference between two things. The next type of contrast I would guess is widely known is color contrast, the difference between colors. This contrast refers to the color wheel from which you pick two opposing colors to maximize your contrast. This is in part why the orange and teal look is so popular, because the contrast is so appealing. But now let's try to find contrast that is lesser referred to. Let's stay with the colors. This here has contrast, but not color contrast. The colors I picked here are the exact same. The variable that creates the contrast here is the saturation of that color. So I guess we can call this saturation contrast. Now, this sort of felt like I simply made up a type of contrast, and yes, that's the point. In this video, I would like to argue that contrast is to be freely created and seen. The non-existence of the word saturation contrast doesn't imply the non-existence of the contrast itself, and it shouldn't. We should allow ourselves to open our mind to all types of contrast we can spot, even when we lack the term. After all, on a base level, contrast is just difference. This, however, poses the following question. Where is the line between contrast and no contrast? Seeing as any two things that are not the same can be described as different, that would make everything that is not the same into contrast to one another, right? This is where our axiom of contrast simply being difference becomes a bit unstable. So what else are the characteristics of contrast then? I think we can state that contrast requires a significant amount of difference to be considered contrast. These two colors are different, but they do not create contrast. Once we move this color further away on the color wheel, we begin to see some contrast, which maxes out once the colors oppose each other on the wheel in a 180-degree angle. So where is the border of this existence and non-existence of contrast? I'd personally argue that this is where the subjectivity of contrast is introduced. There is no clear objective line to be crossed to create contrast. Now that we've set the ground for what contrast generally is, let's explore what other types of contrast we can find or come up with. In the effort of categorizing types of contrast, I found that contrast can be separated into two general groups, visual contrast and contextual contrast. The two are pretty self-explanatory. While visual contrast is recognized with the eye, contextual contrast is the contrast between two things in the photograph that, in the context of this photograph, create a sense of contrast. Here's an example I found in a photograph I showed you in a recent video. The contrast here is not something that is directly visible, but something that is understood, or at least recognized cognitively. The contrast here is between the location, being the beach, and the white plastic chair. While the beach is a beautiful creation of nature which we like to visit for its beauty and the refreshment it offers, we also don't seem to be satisfied entirely by the beach. The beach gives us so much, yet we humans still find the need to domesticate the place by conducting alterations to the place, such as adding lounges, sun protectors, and also white plastic chairs. As stated beforehand, I believe we can spot contrast before naming it and even decide to just make up a type of contrast. Basically, I just think there is no necessity for fixating on the labeling. So anyway, some other expressions of visual contrast I could think of are the following. Contrast in scale, the difference of size within a photograph. Contrast in depth, the difference in the visually communicated depth within a photograph. Contrast in shape, the difference between geometrical shapes and free shapes. Contrast in texture, the difference between the texture of the photograph or the subject. When it comes to contentual contrast, I think it's a bit harder to spot because it simply is not as obvious as visual contrast often is. Here's another example from that beach video of mine. The whole video was about this discrepancy I felt when looking at these photos of the beach. My point was that the beach is a place of oppositions. In this particular case, I was meaning that it's strange how the original intention for the visit at the beach is the enjoyment of the nature, but the actual outcome then is situations like these in which people get distracted by a little shop that sells fashion accessories. The contrast here is contentual. It's found in the amount of difference between the intention and the outcome. That's what made this photo so intriguing for me. Thus we can state that for this photograph, the contentual contrast is essential. Here's a different example, 101 Billionaires by Rob Hornstra. In this book, Rob Hornstra shoots an entire concept that is based on contentual contrast. Rob found out that thanks to the flourishing economy in Russia due to the natural resources they own, Russia has 101 billionaires. He decided that in his project he wants to show the contrast between those at the summit of Russia's wealth and those at the bottom. So he documented the poverty, which the country does not present to the outside. This is a prime example of the contentual contrast not only being a central characteristic of a photograph, but also of the whole project. Now, I think we have come to the point that we understand the immense diversity of contrast, and that leads us to the next question: why? Contrast is diverse and useful in cases, but why use it? What makes contrast such a relevant, if not even fundamental, part of photography? Let's explore that. Let's start with visual contrast. I believe two significant variables that change through the intentional use of visual contrast are the composition and the feeling or mood of a photograph. When analyzing the composition of a photograph, contrast can play an important role in leading the viewer's eye through a photograph. I believe this aspect is especially common in landscape photography. In this photograph by Henry Prestes, the pink light trail stands out strikingly with both its tonal contrast and the color contrast. While the photograph in total is a bit darker and gloomy, this light trail makes its way through the composition, being the brightest thing in the photo with the sun. And while everything in the photo is colorful but all quite muted, the light trail has this vibrant pink hue that enables it to stand out even more. The use of contrast in this example provides direction. Without the light trail, the photograph would probably look quite flat and aimless. But thanks to the light trail, the composition now has a direction and thus also depth. It's a key feature of the photo. A prominent example you've probably seen before is this landscape photograph by Ansel Adams. A key feature in this photograph is the strong contrast of the river. Thanks to its brightness, it clearly stands out as it curves through the dark forest, leading the viewer's eye through the composition from the bottom to the top, where we get to see the mountains in the distance. The river gives this photograph a flow, no pun intended. So the river as a leading line is crucial for the composition, but it only works thanks to the tonal contrast. Then, when we look at how contrast can enhance the feelings and mood of a photograph, I believe Singaporean photographer Nguyen is a beautiful example. When viewing his work, one characteristic of his visual style that stands out to me is the general low contrast of his photography. The shadows are clearly lifted, and overall, the exposure of the photographs are on the brighter side. By reducing or even eliminating the shadows, Nguyen achieves a wonderful effect that I personally find is one of his trademarks: a dreamlike, soft and calm aesthetic. A high level of tonal contrast seems to evoke tension in a photograph, and Nguyen consistently loosens that tension to calm a photograph down, which is necessary to achieve the dreamy feel of his images. So this is a great example to demonstrate the importance of being intentional with contrast. Knowing contrast well doesn't imply adding more contrast to a photograph, but can also mean lowering the contrast. So to answer the question why we should study contrast in a visual sense, I think we can conclude by answering that contrast is a crucial tool to compose photographs more meticulously and to precisely steer the emotional effect of a photograph. Then, let's move on to why contentual contrast is to be considered. In the example I presented by Rob Hornstra, I believe it becomes clear that the contentual contrast is the main element that draws us to those photos. I personally would not consider those photographs to be outstandingly good in a visual sense. What makes the whole project not only interesting but also meaningful is the contentual contrast. And that's the point. Contentual contrast is capable of giving photographs a deeper meaning and even societal relevance. Visual contrast mostly influences the superficial aspects of a photograph, while contentual contrast gives the photograph depth and the possibility to make a viewer think about what the photograph is communicating. So, that was a breakdown of contrast in photography from my perspective. All the points mentioned are aspects of contrast I could think of while breaking this topic down. However, it's certain that I alone am unable to maximize the thoughtfulness and reflection of this topic, and so I'm curious about what you think. The goal is to start some conversations within the community in the comment section. I hope my part could be some decent groundwork, and now I'd love to hear what I missed, so leave any thoughts in the comments. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, leave a like, that'd be highly appreciated. Consider subscribing if you haven't yet, and I'll see you again next week in the next video. Until then, goodbye.